Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have just a quick reminder before we dive into today's episode. A weekend with Elizabeth Woodville, a 2-day online event, begins next week. Explore Elizabeth's life and reign via 6 pre-recorded lectures and 1 live discussion. There will be presentations by Susan Higginbotham, Sarah Griswood, Dr. Lacey Boner-Hull, Dr. Kavita Mudan-Finn, Daniel Burton, and Dr. Owen Emerson. Participants will have access to all the content for 2 months, and you can register from anywhere in the world. For details and to reserve your place, just click on the link below or Google A Weekend with Elizabeth Woodville and Eventbrite. Ticket sales will close on the morning of the 19th of July, so don't miss out. I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge and to thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com or click on the link below. Now, on to today's episode. It was such an honor to chat with Dr. Breeze Barrington about her magnificent new book, The Graces, The Extraordinary Untold Lives of Women at the Restoration Court. Breeze Barrington is a historian specializing in the artistic cultures of the 17th century, with a particular focus on women's history and female artists. She holds a PhD on the literary and artistic cultures of the early Stuart court and has written for outlets including the Financial Times and TLS. Bree has also worked as a consultant for Working Title and Monumental Pictures. Bree has taught at many universities, including the University of Cambridge, and is an Associate Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Breeze. How are you?
Hi, Natalie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really well. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's been a while since we last chatted, so we might just start with an introduction. If you wouldn't mind just saying hi to all our listeners and viewers and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to hear me today. So, I'm Breeze Barrington. I'm a cultural historian specializing in the 17th century, particularly focused on women's artistic production and women's history. So, my current book, The Graces, The Extraordinary Untold Lives of Women at the Restoration Court, came out this July. And so, I'm very much looking forward to chatting with you about it.
Oh, it's so exciting. And I'm going to do a little show and tell here, Breeze, because I've got it here with me. And if you're watching our interview on the Talking Tudors YouTube channel, you'll be able to see the absolutely stunning cover. Honestly, this doesn't really do it justice, this image here, but it is so beautiful. Before we go on, Breeze, can you just tell us a little bit about the sort of inspiration and how you got this amazing cover?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I've been so lucky to have this incredibly brilliant team at Bloomsbury who have taken so much love and care into making it look really beautiful outside and inside. I couldn't have been luckier, honestly. But the image itself is a really fascinating one. It's taken from an embroidery, a kind of sampler that Maria of Modena had with her, certainly in the kind of later part of her life. She took it with her from England into her final exile in 1688, and she still had it in her possession when she died. So the fact that this was one of the very few things that she took with her, she left in a hurry and there wasn't that much time. The fact that she took it with her, the fact that she kept it with her, tells us really that this must have meant a lot to her. But we've got no idea where she got it from or why it mattered so much. The image itself, it seems unlikely to be something that she was embroidering. It's of a slightly different period of costume. It's unfinished. There are lots of things about it which make us think it probably wasn't her own sampler. but yes, like I said, why she had it and why it mattered so much, we don't know. But what I love about it is that it is unfinished, and we have this kind of, I think, having a cover where there's this image of this woman who we don't know where it's come from, we don't know why it's unfinished. It sort of becomes this symbol for so many of the women in the book who have these sort of untold, unfinished stories, and who have sort of remained in obscurity. So I think it's a really lovely cover for the topic of the book.
Oh, I love it so much. It does look like it's been embroidered onto the sort of cover, so it's just amazing. I love it. And of course, we're here to chat about this gorgeous new book. So, in your book at the beginning, you write about a painting that you saw in 2019, I think it was, that provided you with a great deal of inspiration. So, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I was reviewing an exhibition called Bright Souls, England's first women artists, I think it was called, and it was at the Lion and Turnbull Gallery, a really beautiful small gallery in London. And I just sort of walked in. I'd heard it was about Joan Carlyle, Mary Beale, and this woman Anne Killigrew, who were the first three kind of professional painters, English professional painters. And I sort of knew about Mary Beale quite a lot. I knew a bit about Jane Carlyle, but I must admit I'd never heard of Anne Killigrew. And as I was sort of walking through these rooms, I came across this one particular painting, which was called Venus Attired by the Graces by Anne Killigrew. And I was just completely spellbound by it, to be honest. And I didn't necessarily realize at the time that it was literally going to change my life, but I knew that I was sort of witnessing something really remarkable. And it was partly the sort of it's a very arresting picture in the sort of vibrancy of the colors, in the sort of intimacy of the scene. It's these three women sort of clothing their goddess. So these sort of four women together, and you really have the sense that they are communing together, that they're sort of unaware of the viewer, that it's a kind of intimate scene of friendship essentially, and that really shines through. And it's also a sort of slightly strange painting in that so much of it is incredibly skilled and like sort of remarkably good.
Yeah.
But there are other bits of it which are slightly off. And I thought that in itself was interesting, that you could have such sort of great skill and also sort of moments which haven't quite achieved. And then when I looked at the panel, I realised that the painter was very, very young. Anne Killigrew could not have been more than 25 when she made the painting. So there was this sort of obvious talent which was perhaps still being shaped, and that really appealed to me. And then when I was also, when I was looking at the panel, I saw that the figures in the painting were thought to be an allegory. So Anne Killigrew, at the time that she painted it, was a maid of honour to Maria of Modena. And it's thought that the painting, Venus in the painting, represents Maria, and the three graces, Venus's handmaidens, represent Maria's maids of honour. So one of whom was Anne Killigrew. She paints herself sort of crouched at her mistress's feet. They're sort of particularly in conversation with each other. And then there are two other women, the two other graces behind, one of whom is thought to be Anne Finch, the great poet, who at that time was Anne Kingsmill. And the other woman, it was sort of speculated, could have been Sarah Churchill, who was also one of Maria of Modena's maids of honour. Sarah Churchill of The Favourite fame, anyone who's sort of read or seen that film, The Great Favourite of Queen Anne. But this is her much younger. This is her sort of, anything between sort of 13 and 18. And as I sort of started to look into the story a little bit more, I thought it was perhaps unlikely that it was Sarah Churchill, simply because she was a maid of honour at an earlier period. But certainly one of these maids of honour that Maria really sort of fostered and championed, and was a real advocate for them having any kind of independence they could, but also kind of any sort of creativity that they could, which is obviously very difficult for women at this time. So, when I saw this painting, I just thought, wow, that is a great story. and I thought I'd like to do something with that one day. And I didn't really, at the time, necessarily realize I was going to write a book about it. I was finishing my PhD at the time. And so I just sort of kept it in the back of my mind, but it kept sort of fermenting.
Yeah.
And then about a year later, or maybe a little bit,
Wow.
about a year later, I started working on the book, which has become The Graces, named after that very painting.
Oh, I love that story so, so much. It just shows the power of art, I think, in inspiring our own ideas. And it's just a great way to start your book, I think. So, Breeze, this is Talking Tudors. So I am venturing a little bit out of my comfort zone. So could you just set the scene for us? Just tell us a little bit about what's going on in terms of politics, religion, the situation in England at the time that Maria, later known as Mary, comes to England or arrives in England.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for having me,
Yeah,
not
of
as the
course.
Tudors, but I hope, as we go on, we'll sort of see there are still, links to be made. There are
Absolutely.
still the sort of the legacy of the Tudors is still very strong at this point. So Maria arrived in England in 1673, and the England she arrived to was the court of the Merry Monarch, Charles II. So Charles had been back on the throne after the Restoration in 1660, so he's been back for a little while now. And I don't think it would be unfair to say that some of the kind of shininess of Charles had slightly worn off at this point. I think when he'd come back, there'd been an enormous amount of hope and expectation and in goodwill. I think he was really welcomed back by the majority of people. I wouldn't say he was unpopular exactly by this point, but reality is never quite as good as the dream. And it was also kind of clear by this point that he's very unlikely to have any legitimate children. So the future of the dynasty is really in the hands of his brother, James, the Duke of York. So James had two surviving daughters by his first wife, Anne Hyde. Anne Hyde had died in 1671. So when he was sort of when there's talk of a new wife among the princesses of Europe in 1671, it's clear that whoever that is really going to be expected to be producing male heirs. This sort of obviously there had been women on the throne before, but a male heir is still what they would hope for. There's an added kind of complication to this, which is that by this point, it was kind of an open secret that James had converted to Catholicism. And he was adamant that his new wife would absolutely have to be a Catholic. So there's a lot of concerns about a possible Catholic heir, about England sort of coming back to that kind of papal fold forcibly by James when he becomes king. So it's amidst all of this kind of unsettlement, if you like, that Maria arrives in England as a girl of 15 years old. She'd been raised in a convent, she'd wanted to become a nun, and all of a sudden she's pulled out of that and thrown into this kind of quite brutal world of dynastic politics in this incredibly heady and licentious court. And the man she's married is a 40-year-old man, and although he did sort of do his best to be kind to her, this is absolutely not the life she wanted.
No.
So it's quite an intense situation, if you
Mm.
like, that she's suddenly thrown into. And I think that legacy of the last Catholic monarch of Mary I is still very strong in people's minds at this time.
Wow, incredible. And so you've said she's obviously very young when she arrives. Do we know very much about her family? And maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about how she was raised.
Yeah, absolutely. So she was an Este princess. She'd grown up in Modena in Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy. And the Estes had been one of the absolute sort of power Italian families, alongside the sort of Medici and the Borgias, who are perhaps a lot more famous than the Estes are. But the Estes were one of these big, big ruling families. By the time Maria was born, they were rather in decline. Their heyday had been around a century earlier. But sort of in the past, if you like, much of their lands had been sort of taken from them by the Pope, in fact. So they sort of lived in reduced circumstances in Modena, but they still had this great legacy. And much of how they sort of wielded power was through that kind of soft power, through that sort of power of display, which Maria would have grown up really sort of knowing about, really understanding. And we might talk about this later, but she really sort of brought that over with her. But she herself was born in 1658. Her father died when she was just 4 years old, which made her 2-year-old brother the new Duke of Modena. So her mother, Laura, acted as regent in his place until he came of age. And she was mostly educated by governesses and in the palace convent which had been founded by her mother and was attached to the palace by a bridge of sighs. So she's grown up in an environment really of strong women. And her mother was absolutely determined that both of her children, her son and her daughter, would be raised to be intellectuals and to be resourceful and to be powerful and to really represent this great family that they were from. You know, she took that very seriously for both of them. So Maria was very, very highly educated. You know, she spoke ancient languages, modern languages. She'd learned history. She'd learned geography. For a woman of her sort of generation, if you like, she was particularly well educated. I think in Italy that happened more often than in England. But if we sort of think about that sort of life she'd had, and then how she sort of got to the court of Charles II, where women very rarely had an education, certainly not an education like that, it must have been a real shock to her. But she'd also then grown up in this very quiet and sort of literally cloistered life. You know, in this convent, she would have met very few people who weren't clergy or members of her family. So it's a very quiet life. It's a very sheltered life. And her deepest desire from a very young age was to become a nun. And it seems that no one ever really told her that this was unlikely to happen. And maybe, you know, it seems a lot of the time that Laura was on her side about this, but Laura had one daughter, and this is really her only opportunity to spread the Este dynasty abroad. And when it sort of came to it, the lure of having her daughter, you know, the Estes, on the throne of England was much too important, and it overtook everything else. So Maria had to go.
Goodness, what a shock for poor Maria after that, leading that sort of intellectual life, quiet life. So before we talk a little bit more about her reign, her as queen, can you tell us a little bit about what life was like for aristocratic and royal women at this time? You've sort of mentioned there that perhaps education, certainly not to the standard that Maria was educated to, it was common. So what's life like for women at this point?
Yeah, so the women that she will have met when she arrived, the English women she will have met, the first of whom perhaps were her stepdaughters, who were very close to her in age. In fact, when James found out that he was married to Maria, because the marriage was done by proxy, so he was sort of told about it later,
Right.
he sent a message to his daughter Mary, the future Queen Mary, wife of William III. And he said that he'd found a playfellow for her. So there's this real sense that everyone knows that they're actually very close in age. So these probably were the main women, girls that she would have spent time with. And the princesses were educated in a very sort of traditional way for English royal princesses, in that they would, in terms of their learning, they were given very little of the sort of history, geography, ancient languages. They had none of that like Maria had, but they would have spoken French flawlessly. That was an absolutely key to an English aristocratic or royal women's education. They would have been exceptional dancers, and we know they were, and singers. And in particular, the future Queen Anne, she had an incredible singing voice and had someone who trained her, an actress who trained her, and she really, this was a great, great talent. So they sort of excelled in the pursuits that young women should excel in, and they had drawing masters as well. So kind of drawing as an elite hobby, if you like, for young women of the court. So these are the kinds of ways that women were expected to be. They were essentially ornamental, and so they're sort of trained to be delightful ornaments in that
Yeah.
way, which
Yeah,
is problematic for both Anne and Mary, who became queens of England, and for whom some
absolutely.
sort of sense of history, politics, the constitution might have been helpful. And of course, they, to some extent, in terms of politics, will have learned much about the politics of the court by living in it. But I'm sure that they would have been grateful for a more formal education when their time came.
Yeah, interesting. So it does sound like there's been a sort of shift in educating royal women, because I'm of course just thinking back to the Tudor period in terms of
Yeah,
the Tudor princesses, Elizabeth, for example, Mary, who were highly educated in lots of
yeah,
different areas. So was there a sort of shift in focus?
absolutely. I mean, this might be sort of too broad a thing to say, so I apologize for that. But I think there's a general sense that people were less educated, not perhaps not just women. I mean, I don't think that Charles and James, I mean, I suppose it's difficult to talk about their education because they'd grown up with this backdrop of the Civil War and
Hmm.
living in exile. So perhaps that's a little bit unfair on their part, and they were certainly interested in learning. I mean, they were great supporters and of the things like the Royal Society. So I think that there is a kind of, they live in an era where there's great strides in
Hmm.
discovery and things like that. But I think in terms of like the sort of the formal education, the sort of the learning Latin by rote, I think
Yeah.
we've moved quite a long way away from that now,
Hmm.
both for men and women.
How fascinating, really interesting. And so, talk to us a little bit more about Maria's court. So, what pastimes, pursuits, activities were valued and promoted, especially given, she's brought her experience and this highly educated woman?
Yeah, so one of the first things she did actually when she arrived in England, she sort of, when she arrived, she wasn't greeted, she wasn't sort of welcomed with open arms. As I said before, she's this Catholic princess, and an Italian Catholic is
Right.
probably the worst thing she could have been for England at this time. And rumors circulated that she was the Pope's bastard daughter,
Mm.
and the day she arrived, there were sort of bonfires in the street, and effigies of the Pope were burned, and it's a really, really febrile atmosphere that she comes into. And at the court, it wasn't all that much better. I think there were a lot of people who were very reluctant to show favour to her for fear of how it would look. So she had a very different reception to someone like Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's wife, when she'd arrived. Because although she was a Catholic as well, this is kind of, Charles at least openly was not. And so there's a sense when Maria arrives that she brings a bad thing. She brings this
Right.
kind
Yeah.
of future worry. So she knows that she's not very welcome, and she's very, very young. She didn't speak any English, but she did learn very quickly. But she spoke sort of French. Everyone spoke French, so she can communicate with people. But one of the first things she did when she arrived was she looked around and she thought, okay, they really like their court entertainments, they like their plays, they like their music, they like their fun. And she commissioned a court masque. And so this is a really good way for her to ingratiate herself in the court. And it's sort of reigniting a tradition which had been very, very popular, particularly under Charles I. And and historically before that, I mean, I think it sort of reached its peak at the court of Charles I. But the court masque has its roots all the way back to Henry VIII. The masques, I'm sure that you know about this. The masques were happening at the
Yeah.
court.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of thought that Anne Boleyn might have met
Yeah.
Henry VIII at a court masque, isn't there? I don't know if that's true or not. But,
Uh,
the court masques were
yes,
a
we
big
we could debate
entertainment.
that, Breeze, but I won't divert things.
I will bow to your expertise. So the court masques, had been a part of court culture for a long time.
Mhm.
But I said under Charles I, it had really reached this huge, grand peak, and the equivalent of millions of pounds could have been spent on a single night's entertainment, and they were incredibly lavish affairs. Huge, sort of sets and scenery, incredible costumes, and you'd have a mixture of courtiers and professional musicians and dancers and actors taking part in these things. And in some ways, the court masque under Charles I became a kind of symbol for his detachment, his growing detachment from the realities of life, from the court, from the country, from Parliament. And I'm not sort of saying it caused the Civil War, but it's certainly a symbol for lots of the unrest around that time. So although court masques did occasionally happen under Cromwell, they weren't really quite so in vogue, and certainly Charles II hadn't really reignited that tradition when he first came back. So she comes and she commissions this masque. She commissions it from a man called John Crown, and he's given very little time to do it. And it's an unusual commission for him because he wasn't the court poet at the time, and he had written plays before, but this was a very different, much sort of bigger spectacle really than he would have been used to do. And it's thought that he was suggested to Maria by John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, and as part of a sort of quite a big feud that he was having with Dryden at the time. Dryden, who should have been asked as the poet laureate. So John Crown is given this great task, and he's got an afternoon to come up with a story, basically. And Charles II suggests to him the story of Callisto from Ovid. And I mean, Callisto, it's difficult to think of a less appropriate story, really, um, because Callisto is a story of rape, seduction, sort of pregnancy, death, and the characters were supposed to be played by the princesses Mary and Anne and other ladies of the court, who were basically children. So I'm sure that Charles II had a little bit of a gleam in his eye when he suggested this story, realizing how difficult it was going to be. It's a sort of amusement, which I'm sure he would have enjoyed. So Cran essentially has to rewrite this entire thing in an afternoon. And it becomes this great thing which sort of takes over the court for months. They're sort of rehearsing, every day of the week for hours, and it's this really, really big spectacle. New parts of the theatre are built onto it, and they have sort of this incredibly elaborate set put on, and it's going to be this great big event. And it's really something that Maria puts on to showcase her stepdaughters' talents. He said, she finds that they are great singers, they are great dancers, and she goes, let's show them off, let's give them the main roles. The other main role that's given is to Sarah Churchill, Sarah Jennings then, who is one of Maria's first maids of honour. So this is one of the kind of early ways in which she's sort of fostering the talents of the women around her. And she's doing it in the language of the court. So she's quite quickly adapting. In her sort of private rooms, just to sort of go back to that, the question of what goes on at her court, if you like, in her rooms, when I use the word private advisedly, private, there's no such thing as private at a court like this. It's just a bit more private.
Yeah.
So the kinds of things that went on at her court would have been music making. She was a very sort of gifted musician herself, and James as well played the guitar, and so they would make music together. Members of their court would make music together. So that was part of the sort of evening's entertainments, if you like. As time went on and she had a little more autonomy in how she spent her time, I suppose because she got used to how things worked, she'd been there longer, she became, accepted in different ways. She had women around her who were artists and poets, people like Anne Killigrew, people like Anne Finch. They became her maids of honour in the early 1680s. And this really then became a time when her women were producing poetry and were still producing entertainments for her, but they were entertainments that they had written, perhaps. They were entertainments which they were accompanying paintings for, and it became this sort of much more female-focused way of life.
Mm. It does sound like a real intellectual hub and a sort of female network, doesn't it? That they're all a part of. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about how these women and other women at the time are sort of pushing those patriarchal boundaries and exerting a little bit of agency over their own lives.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's very difficult at this time. So initially, as I said before, women were very rarely that highly educated. Lots of the women who Maria surrounded herself with, particularly in the 1680s, that's less true for. So Anne Finch and Killigrew were highly educated. We don't know. I mean, we know a little more about Anne Finch's education in the countryside. She lived with another family, and they're very likely to have sort of had ancient languages and to have had more of a formal education. And Killigrew, not really sure exactly how, but her work tells us that she was, if you see what I mean, that it's incredibly learned in the poetry. You can see all of these classical references, all of these biblical references. Clearly a lot of learning has gone on there. And Anne Killigrew was born into an artistic family. They were a family of courtiers, but her uncle was a playwright and he was a manager of the King's Theatre, and her father was the almoner, the Church of England almoner to James, which was a slightly tricky position for him to be in since James was a Catholic. Deeply embedded in the court, and he also wrote poetry and things like that. So she comes from sort of writing chops, if you like, but also deeply aristocratic chops. And in terms of her education as a painter, there are several possibilities of how she learned to paint. So, for example, one thing that's been sort of put out there is that she could have been taught by either Jane Carlyle or Mary Beale, both of whom she would have lived very close to when she was growing up, both of whom had students, female students. So it's possible that she would have learned with them. Or alternatively, the court painter Peter Lely, it was another sort of possibility to have taught her. But as I said before, it wasn't necessarily unusual for young women like that to have drawing masters and things. So that's the kind of education which is a little more available, though the level that she achieved suggests something a lot more than these other women will have had.
And so tell us a little bit. You've been naming some people there, of course, that are part of Mary's circle, and they sound absolutely fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about them, maybe introduce us to some of them, and tell us a little bit more about those artistic and intellectual activities and achievements.
So I think the main people to speak about in terms of the artistic and cultural production, if you like, around the court of Maria is going to be Anne Finch and Killigrew, who I was just mentioning before. And they became her maids of honour in the early 1680s. So Maria had actually been living in exile, her and James and that court had been living in exile for a few years, but they were back in the 1680s period, and perhaps we'll kind of come on to the reasons for that exile a bit later. But she kind of comes back, she has this new court and she has these new women. So Anne Killigrew, as I said, she was a courtly, came from a courtly family. Although the Killigrews, actually going back, were a little bit more murky than that. They'd actually were a big pirating family in Cornwall from Falmouth. And in that kind of Elizabethan period particularly, they'd been incredibly lucrative, plundering Spanish ships that came anywhere near the coast, and they'd sort of amassed enormous wealth from this. And essentially, Elizabeth I had really turned a blind eye, because if you're just plundering Spanish ships, then that's fine by her. Yeah. And and it's quite useful to have this sort of big, loyal, powerful family on the coast who you just sort of let do their thing. But when Elizabeth died and James I came to the throne, a sort of faction of the Killigrews thought, oh, let's go honest and let's go to the court. So they were actually part of the train that welcomed James back. So this kind of branch of the family is sort of immediately embedded in this new dynasty, and they remain so. So that's the line of the family, if you like, that Anne Killigrew comes from. And as I say, she was sort of raised in and around the court. Her family were very embedded in the court. Her aunt actually was one of Charles II's mistresses, so you can't get much more embedded in the court than that. And so she's grown up knowing how all of this operates. Anne Finch, on the other hand, she was born Anne Kingsmill. She arrived at court as a maid of honour, and she'd lived in the countryside before that. She'd been orphaned very young, and she was raised essentially by her uncle and his family. But her father had been an amateur poet, and he'd left provision in his will for his daughters to be educated highly. So we know that she had a kind of family expectation that she would be educated. So she's got that kind of instilled in her. She, and as I said, the sort of father who had also written poetry, I think that she grew up aware of all of these things, and she grew up with this education. That she was then sent to court as a maid of honour. Essentially, maids of honour are usually from families who are highborn but not necessarily that wealthy. So the idea is they go to court to look for a husband, and the court pays their dowry. So it's a good setup, if you like, for these big families who may not be able to afford much of a dowry themselves, but they are expected to be sort of attractive and attracting. When it's people like Anne Finch and Anne Killigrew, you can see quite early on that even if that's the expectation, they've got very little intention of doing that themselves. There's much, especially for Anne Killigrew, there's an enormous amount of ambition in her work. But it wasn't very easy. So when she first was writing poetry and she first circulated her poetry, she was accused of plagiarism. She was accused of stealing the work of a male poet and passing it off as her own. And she wrote this sort of furious poem in response, which is so erudite and is so learned. And it's a real challenge. It's such a kind of, if you didn't, you think I didn't write that, well, how about this?
Yeah.
And it's absolutely wonderful. It's called Upon the Saying My Verses Were Made by Another, if anyone wants to look it up. It's absolutely brilliant. So you kind of quickly get the sense that these women are in a society in which there are expectations, but they're not going to live by those expectations. And Maria's court is a place where they don't necessarily have to. And although Anne Kingsmill did marry, she initially refused Heneage Finch, her future husband, a number of times, and finally she agreed. But he was a huge champion of her abilities. He was really proud of what a brilliant poet she was, and he worked basically for her as her editor. He copied out her poems. She reportedly had unreadable handwriting, so he would write the poems out for her and make these sort of perfect copies. And after she died, he continued to sort of champion her works. So she wasn't sort of constrained by that marriage.
Yeah, and given how challenging it was for women at this time, especially women involved in those creative and intellectual spheres, how important do you think female friendships and those female networks were to them?
Yeah, exceptionally important. I mean, thinking back to Anne Killigrew sort of circulating some of her poems amongst people and being told that she couldn't have written it. I mean, I think that these women, when they sort of circulated works amongst each other, they're not going to have any of that, right? This is a kind of a place in which they will take each other seriously, and there is evidence of a sort of a broader female coterie network, which may have also have involved a woman called Mary Evelyn, who was the daughter of the diarist John Evelyn, and there are poems that Anne Killigrew wrote which are sort of dedicated to or have the character of, under a sort of pastoral guise, of another woman at court called Isabella Fitzroy Bennet. And so you kind of have this sense of these women writing for each other, writing to each other, writing about each other in a way in which they know they won't be judged, and
Yeah.
they'll be able to produce. So I think it creates that kind of haven, to be honest. There's also another way in which these female friendships are important, which is in navigating this court. I said before about how sort of heady and licentious it was. Maids of honor are sent there expected to be attractive, to be ornamental. They're also basically subject to the prey of the men of the court, who really consider these maids fair game. It's a dangerous place, and you could very easily lose your reputation, lose your honor in in more or less consensual ways. This is a really dangerous place for a young woman. Sarah Churchill, when she was Sarah Jennings' maid of honor to Maria, she wrote later in life of how, as a maid there, she'd had these great friendships and she'd been really helped by them, that she'd been advised and guided by women who'd been there a bit longer than her, people like a woman called Mary Fortree, a woman called Barbara Villiers, not to be confused with Charles II's mistress. This is a different Barbara Villiers, and a more virtuous one. And these are ways that this is a dangerous place for women, and they help each other to navigate it, whether that's in terms of socially, or whether that's in terms of kind of cultural production. It's just a place where they're, hopefully looking out for each other. This isn't always true. A woman called Mary Trevor, who was another of Maria's maids of honor, she didn't have those kinds of avenues available to her, and she really had to leave the court in disgrace. So this is a very real thing that happens. And in fact, amongst Maria's first maids of honor, it was sort of someone commented at the time that she has such bad luck with her maids because they're all like becoming pregnant and having to leave in disgrace. So this is a difficult world for these young women, and yeah, as I said, I think these friendships really help them navigate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked earlier about the fact that Maria spent some time in exile. So tell us a little bit more about the challenges that she navigated.
Yeah, so as I said, when at the beginning she arrived at this court, which was very, very febrile, and it didn't become less so. This sort of fear of this future possible Catholic rule, if you like, was always present. And in 1678, she'd been there for about 5 years. This sort of really came to the fore in the sort of first really big way, when a man called Titus Oates and his accomplice Israel Tongue came forward, and they told Charles II of a Catholic plot that they had discovered, which had really penetrated the heart of the court. And so, some of the most leading Catholic courtiers, even they said Catherine of Braganza was implicated in this plot to overthrow and to kill Charles II. And this plot would see, sort of Protestants killed in the streets. It was a big kind of fear-mongering accusation. It was also completely untrue. It was completely fabricated, but it preyed on a lot of the fears of the time, if you like. And it was also very convenient for a lot of people at the time to have this sort of ability to rout out Catholics, if you like. So it really took hold. And there were people, even people close to Maria, who were executed as traitors. People like Edward Coleman, her secretary. When I say they were executed as traitors, I mean they were hung, drawn, and quartered. So gruesome ends to people who hadn't really done anything. And it absolutely took hold in the court. And Charles thought it was probably best if James and Maria were sent away into exile for a while. This sort of hope that it might die down a bit if they weren't sort of physically there and people didn't sort of see them. So they were initially sent to Brussels and then later to Scotland to live out this sort of period of exile. So they came back in sort of 1681. So they'd lived away for this time. And as I say, she hadn't been there all that long really. And then she sort of sent away and then, sort of very briefly back and then back off to Scotland. And then when she sort of came back at the beginning of the 1680s, there was actually a real plot that then came through, which would have had both James and Charles executed. And this was the Rye House plot, this was called. So she's really got a lot to contend with in this way. And during this time, during the Popish plot, she had to send away a lot of her Italian household, and other members of the court had to send away their households too. So it was very isolating as well as frightening. And I think that there's so much sort of fear at this time. Obviously, people were being rounded up, people were being executed, but also there's always this memory of Charles I's execution close by. So they sort of always know that and Charles knows this too, they sort of know that they're at the mercy of other powers than themselves, that sort of being royal, being monarchs isn't necessarily enough. So it's a very, very difficult time. When she came back after the Rye House plot was sort of routed and that was all sort of finished, if you like, she has a couple of years of quiet and where things seem to have settled down. I think that people were really tired of the bloodshed by that point, and there is this kind of peace which goes on. And then Charles II died in 1685, and all of a sudden James is King of England and she's his queen, and there's a sort of, well, what's going to happen now? We've got these years of very, very recent past in which this kind of sense of what's going to happen, this sort of anti-Catholicism has been so vibrant. And part of the Popish plot, part of what happened during that was that Parliament brought forward the Exclusion Bill. This was known as the Exclusion Crisis, it was a bill which would have seen James taken out of the line of succession. So, this is really, really recent. And that only didn't pass because Charles, dismissed Parliament and he never called them again. So we've got this very, very recent, and now all of a sudden he's king, and they're thinking, are we going to be accepted? Are they going to let us rule? So, she died in 1673 and Charles died in 1685. This is such a short period of time, really. And she's still so young.
So young. That's what I was just thinking.
And, I think, one of the things that is important to know about Maria is that she must have been so resilient when you think about it. Her life was in England was constantly one of having her world fall apart and rebuilding it again, and having everything taken away and then rebuilding it. And you see her doing it time and time again. And as I say, I think she must have been the most resourceful and strong-minded woman.
Yeah, I think that's something so many women have in common when you study women from the past. They are often, it's that courage, that incredible resilience to get yourself back up and keep going after the most awful things happen to you. I find them so inspiring, their stories so inspiring. And so, Breeze, you looked, of course, at the writing of a number of women when you were researching and writing your book. So what sort of important insights did you get from reading the writing of women in this period?
I think one of the things that's really struck me when I was looking was actually how many there were. Not just in terms of sort of what they were producing, but there were more than I thought there would be. And I sort of went into this book with this sort of in the back of my head thinking, okay, well, there's Anne Killigrew, there's Anne Finch, that can be my big writers. And then, there's Aphra Behn if I want to do a sort of around the court and, these are my women kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then when I got into the various different archives and I started to look through people's papers, I found there was this, sort of people like Mary Evan that I was saying, she produced a lot of poetry. She produced this sort of sweet little like kind of short story. She produced a brilliant kind of satirical tract, and she was a great writer. And then there were people like there was a woman called Anne Wharton who will have grown up with the princesses in the nursery at the court. Her aunt, whose care she was under, was a lady of the bedchamber to Anne Hyde, and she would have grown up really deeply embedded in that court. She was then married, much against her will, very young, to a very feckless man who was really just marrying her for her money and treated her very badly. But Anne Wharton, born Anne Lee, she produced a wonderful sort of play. She produced poetry, and there was all of this kind of work just going on. And even when they didn't have a clear outlet for it, they were still producing. And this was something I thought was fascinating and really underdocumented, that we have certain figures that we know because they were very prolific or because they published or because they were respected in their time. But you also just have all of these women who just wrote things, and really good things. It isn't just that they were, it wasn't just sort of play. These are brilliant, brilliant works. So that was the most striking thing for me, was realizing actually just how much went on.
Yeah, that's so interesting, of course, because then I assume that many people listening who are writers can relate to that. We do this work because we love it, not necessarily because we have these incredible outlets or are going to publish our work. It's that's really important,
Yeah.
I think. So in your prologue, Breeze, you write that it is a cliche that history is written by the victors, but it is not just a question of how history is written. It is also how it is preserved, discarded, or suppressed. I found that discussion particularly interesting. So could you just unpack that for us a little bit?
Of course. So I think anyone who's tried to research women's history will find that there's much that is missing. And it can often be that, unlike with lots of the letters written by men or the documents about men, which will have often been, routinely copied and preserved in archives, and people will have thought about their legacy in a particular way, that happens much less frequently for women. That a lot of the paper, if you like, for women just won't have survived the passage of time, which can be a sort of struggle to say innocent negligence, but a negligence rather than an active suppression. But it's just a sort of fact that people have historically cared much less about what women were doing and what women were writing, what women thought about. So there's much less that survives. When I talk about these women as having, I found that there was so much more than I was expecting. Imagine how much more there actually was that we haven't got access to now. So that was the sort of the first thing in terms of a sort of basic whose history is being told. That you will always have the dominant sort of male white voices which have been preserved more than others. So that's the first thing. There are exceptions to this. So people like Sarah Churchill, she really thought she would be remembered, and she was very careful about what her legacy would be. So she actually heavily edited her archive. Throughout her life, she went through the papers that were there, and she threw away things she didn't want people to know. So we only ever have access really to what she wanted us to see. So that's always something to consider. But there are other things that happen too. For example, the household records of all of these different courts, if you like, most of them are preserved in some form. A lot of them are at the British Library or in the state papers. And for Maria's court and James's court, there's hardly any. There are sort of 2 books, maybe of 2 different years, and the rest is just sort of missing. Things like that are very strange. And I think that there is a sense that after the revolution, people didn't want to kind of worry about keeping these things. This is a whole sort of, they were only monarchs for sort of 3 years or so. And obviously before that, there had been all of these unrest while they were Duke and Duchess of York. I think there's a sense when there's the new regime that they don't necessarily want to keep this stuff. They don't necessarily want to have this period as well documented. So I would almost say that at points this is a kind of suppression, that there are things which are deliberately not kept. This is not a past they want remembered. And certainly people in their own archives try to ensure that they don't have documents which link them to the past regime, to the Jacobites, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous to be considered a Jacobite sympathiser. So there's definitely going to be a destruction of certain documents at that point. You also have things like James II wrote lots of diaries. He wanted to have his memoirs preserved for the ages. He wanted people to kind of have his accounts. And they were copied out several times, and there are sort of bits of them, perhaps unauthorised, floating about. But the person who was left in charge of the documents after he died, so they sort of got passed down into sort of 3 generations. And then the French Revolution comes along. And all of a sudden, the person who has these documents thinks, okay, we've got to get them out of the country. This obviously isn't safe. As he's trying to get them out, he is stopped at the border and he is told that he has to go to an interview in the morning. And in a panic, he and his wife burn all of them in a bonfire because they're worried about what will happen if they're found. And then he goes to the interview in the morning. It's complete formality. He's let through. All would have been fine. But this is the kinds of things. This is the instability, if you like. So some of it's negligence, some of it's fear, some of it's very, very active. We do not want to have this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think when we're thinking about how history is made, how history is written, we can only ever deal with what's in front of us and what's been left behind. And we should always be questioning what's left behind and why, and what might have not been left.
So fascinating, and such a good tip, I think, for any historians or
It's
people wanting to be historians.
always treat your sources with caution.
Yeah, it is so complex, isn't it? Not just to the people complex, the history complex, but then that journey, that sort of journey of
Yeah.
preservation complex as well. Nothing's ever easy, as I always say. So what do you think Mary and the other women that you've talked a little bit about, and the other women in her circle, should be remembered for? If there's, a few things that you want your readers to take away from your book, what are they?
So I think what they should be remembered for is having forged their paths in a world which made it difficult for them.
Yeah.
I think the fact that we have been able to find out as much about them as we have shows that they must have produced a lot, that they must have left quite a significant mark for these things to have filtered through. As I said before, it was not easy, it's not straightforward, it's not clear that these stories that we're going to have access to any of these lives, and the fact that we do is a testament to just how strong they must have been, and to how they must have been considered at the time. People like Anne Killigrew, her father, when she died very tragically at the age of 25 of smallpox. Her father had her work published after her death because he wanted people to know she was a writer, because he wanted her to be remembered. And once that happened, it was then, her writing was kept in print. This is something which kind of came through. People of different generations then will have respected her enough. She has obviously been neglected and greatly neglected over time, but the fact that survives tells us something about how she was considered. Thinking though about the kind of going back ever so slightly, thinking about her works, thinking about what's preserved. Her father did write in the introduction to those poems that he only included the best ones. So again, we kind of have this sort of sample, if you like, of what she's producing, with very little sense of what the other things would have been. And I think, as I said, this kind of great resilience of Maria, this sort of world that they've created, which was kind of against all odds for all of them. And I think it's really impressive, and I think it's worth remembering. And I think if anyone is remembering Maria, they should just remember how powerful she must have been, and what a great sort of presence to go into this world, which is so challenging, to create and to foster the sort of talents of the women around her, and to kind of create this world in which women could produce, and to have so much adversity, but to still be to still be considering how she can be of use to other women.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. A world designed to restrict them, and look what they do. It's just so inspiring. And I'm sure that all our listeners and viewers want to learn more about these amazing women. So, of course, pick up a copy of The Graces, this beautiful book. Just a lovely, thing to have in your study, I have to say, apart from the brilliant content, Breeze. Just amazing. And if people want to find out a little bit more about you and your work, where can they go?
So I have a website which has all of the different articles that I've written and sort of different things about my book, which is just breezebarrington.com. That's probably the best place to
Yeah.
look. But I'm also on, Instagram and things like that. So I'll always be sort of posting new things. So yes, do give me a follow if you're interested to find out more.
Beautiful. And I'll add some links to those to make it nice and
Thank
easy for
you.
people to find you. And the very last thing, I can't let you go just yet. Sorry, you've been so generous with your time, is our 10 to go. So 10 little questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the
Okay.
first one is, if you could find any artifact, maybe something that we've lost, so it might be a painting. I know you love art, or it could be any other artifact. What would it be? What do you really want to get your hands on?
Oh gosh, that is such a good question. So many things.
I know
I
there's
think,
lots.
I mean, I'm still very much sort of in this headspace of the Graces, and I think the
Yeah.
thing that I really, really would have liked to have, I did try to track it down, but it's extremely difficult. Is Anne Killigrew was the first woman in England to paint their monarch from life, and there's a coronation portrait of James II, very, very beautiful painting, which hangs at Hillsborough Castle. It's part of the Royal Collection. And a sort of fun little detail about that quickly is that the coat that he's wearing, the sort of beautiful sort of brocaded robe, is actually the same garment that Venus is about to be clothed with in Venus Attired by the Graces. So there's some kind of little in joke or a bit of
Mm.
intimacy being shown here. And actually, we do know that Maria did sometimes wear the same clothes as James, so there is something going on.
Oh.
But to go back to the question, the portrait that she made of Maria is lost. We have no idea what happened to it. But there is a photograph of a painting thought to be Mary of Modena by Anne Killigrew, and the photograph is kept at the Heinz Archive at the National Portrait Gallery, and it is the only kind of record that exists of this painting, and it's thought that it might be that painting, and it must be somewhere. But since that photograph was taken, it's just completely disappeared. And I have been trying to track it down, but to no avail. So if anyone knows anything about a painting that looks like it might be Mary of Modena and has stylistic similarities to Anne Killigrew, please do let me know.
Oh
So
my
that's what I'd like
goodness.
to find. I'd like to find that
Oh,
painting.
I love those like little mysteries. I'm sad that we don't have it, but I mean, they're so kind of juicy to get into those
Yeah.
deep, deep rabbit holes. Oh, well, I hope somebody has a little bit of information and they can contact you and let you know straight away. What about a historic site, Breeze? Maybe one associated with some of these people that we've been discussing that you enjoy visiting.
Well, I think for the one of the, I mean, the place I most enjoy visiting, to be honest, from a sort of history point of view, is, and you'll back me up on this, Natalie, I think, is Hampton Court Palace. I mean,
100%.
there's just not how can you get better? And I think that for this sort of period, it's also really fascinating. You go for the Tudors a lot of the time, and I
Yeah.
think that's great. The Tudor apartments are absolutely spectacular, but just along the corridor from there are the William III apartments, and in the William III apartments you have things like the Windsor Beauties, which were created, the women of Charles II's court, all in kind of various states of undress. And it's a real insight into the way that women were sort of viewed at the time and the way that women were part of that kind of court. And then sort of downstairs in the sort of the private apartments, you have the Hampton Court Beauties, who were the women of Mary II's court. So Princess Mary in my book becomes Queen Mary, and she has a whole new set of paintings done. And these are the women of her court, and these women are much more kind of covered up. It's a totally different view of the court. And I think in these two sets of paintings, you can just see this sort of fundamental shift in a basically a kind of 20-30 year period. It's not a huge time shift, but it's a huge kind of culture shift. And I think those William III apartments in general are just such a an amazing way to be able to see how the court operated. You know, how you had the varying degrees of public rooms, which
Mhm.
gradually become more and more private, and just the way that that day-to-day life will have been. I think those apartments are really spectacular.
Yeah, I love that because obviously we've lost that sense of moving through for the Tudor apartments. So it's nice to at least be
Yeah.
able to see it for the. It's funny how it's like the two faces of Hampton Court, and I'm trying to teach myself to slow down when I get to, to the end of the haunted gallery. I'm like, okay, you can do this. Step in and just keep going.
Absolutely.
So funny. What about the last book that you read, or perhaps one that you're currently reading?
So I've been wading through the Magic Mountain for far too long, which is actually partly research for my next book, which may sound
Mm.
unusual considering I'm a 17th centuryist, but this is going to be something a little bit different. And yes, I've been reading the Magic Mountain, um, which is I think is a brilliant book, but I get bogged down a little
Mm.
bit. And as I've been dipping in and out of it, I've also been reading an amazing biography of Lucrezia Borgia, which I would recommend to
Oh,
anybody. I think it's by Sarah Bradford, I think she's called. Really, really brilliant. Such a fascinating woman. Again, someone who there have been, we have so many different interpretations of her, but I think she's gone down in history as either this sort of evil poisoner
mm,
or else as this kind of sort of virginal victim. And she's, so I imagine the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think
absolutely. Yeah.
the book is really brilliant at pulling out what she actually did in her life. And again, she was a real patron of women, and
Mhm.
she had so many obstacles, and was told to do so much of the time. But when she was able to kind of have a moment of forging her own path, she used it to be a kind of a patron, to wield her own kind of soft power. So yeah, fascinating woman and a fascinating biography. Highly
Oh,
recommend.
another one to add to the very long TBR list. Oh my goodness, ridiculously long. And what about when you're writing, and you're working? Do you have any rituals that you like to follow?
Yeah, I've got some power songs I like to put on.
Oh, power songs. I love it.
Yeah, when I feel that I've got a big day ahead and I need to try and get into it, then I put on things like "Girl on Fire" by Alicia Keys,
Love it.
and yeah, sort of probably dance like a bit of a loon in my study. That was a bit more than I meant to share. So so things like that, but also I find actually a lot of the time just going out to my local cafe with the notepad and paper and just writing down the first things that kind of come into my mind about the work that I'm trying to do at that time is a really good way of just unlocking.
Mhm.
Because sometimes, especially if you're starting a new chapter or something, I personally find that blank page on a computer really, really, really difficult. And so just going out, just writing whatever it is
Mm.
that sort of comes out and not worrying about it because it doesn't need to be perfect. And then coming back and sort of starting to type it up, and then it just sort of turns into its own thing, and then all of a sudden the
Yeah.
page isn't blank anymore. I'd say that's definitely a kind of writing
Yeah.
tip.
Yeah, I love that. I actually read something or saw it recently where somebody suggested when that happens and you're kind of staring at that blank page to go off, like you've said, to a different setting, maybe your
Yeah.
cafe, and just write all the things that you know about whatever it is you're trying to write. And you'll see quite quickly that, oh, hey, I do know a lot about whatever it is I'm trying to write. And then, go back to the page and see if that kind of unlocks the creativity. So great. I need all the tips I can get. So I love it. Um, what about a new skill that you might like to learn?
Oh gosh, that's a very interesting one. A new skill that I'd like to learn. This isn't a new skill, but I would really like to get back into playing the piano because I used to
Yeah.
play a lot. I used to play every day and I used to really, really love it. And then I had an accident and I sort of severed the nerves in one of my hands, and it was more challenging after that. And I
Mm.
can still play, but I just haven't really since then. And
Yeah.
I've been thinking recently how much I'd like to start again. So in some ways a new skill because relearning is
Yeah.
almost the same,
Absolutely.
almost the
Yeah,
same as
for
learning from
sure.
scratch after a long period. But yes, I'll uh, getting back into playing the piano. I find it very, very
Wonderful.
therapeutic.
Yeah, it would be. I've never learnt how to play the piano, but when I see people playing, I think, oh, I love it. It's just so inspiring. And what about Breeze when you were a child? What did you hope to be when you were older?
I wanted to be an actress actually when I was
Yeah.
a child. Yeah, I did. But I think that becoming a writer was more inevitable. I think
Yeah.
when I was a child, what I actually did do a lot was write little stories. And I'm sure
Oh.
lots of children did, but I think, I think that it was sort of in hindsight, I was always obsessed with history and I was always
Mm.
writing something. So, when I used to go to Hampton Court as a child, my granny used to live quite near. So we used to go to Hampton Court quite often. And I mean, they must have hated me, the people who worked there. I used to run down the haunted gallery screaming, pretending to be Catherine Howard, who I was obsessed with at the time. And so, I think that was the sort of like wanting to embody the person that made me want to be an actress thing. But actually, you embody the person when you're writing about them as well.
Mm.
And
For
I think
sure. Yeah.
that's where that's all come out.
Oh, I love that. Now I'm imagining little Breeze running down the gallery, pretending to
I'm
be
sure
Catherine.
some of them remember. Oh no, it's her again.
Yeah, she's back. Um, and what about a film that you've watched recently, or perhaps one that you sort of go back to for, comfort reasons or entertainment?
Oh, I mean, there's no better film for me for kind of going back to and watching for comfort. Well, actually, I take that back. There are two that I would say that about. One of which is I Capture the Castle. Both the book and the film. I don't normally reread books, but I will always reread that, and I will always rewatch that film. They're both just so wonderful, and they just sort of take me to a very happy place. The other film I really love watching is the Winona Ryder Little Women, and I
Oh,
just think that is such a, again, the book. I will reread that book, and I'll rewatch that film. They're both exceptionally comforting, and I
oh.
always cry.
They are both so beautiful, absolutely. And I've lost count of how many questions I've asked you, so I'll ask you one more. Um, is there a great piece of advice that either you've read or you've been given that you would be able to share with us? And it could be about absolutely anything.
um, yes, I think the best piece of advice I ever heard, which wasn't told to me personally, but I saw it in an interview, was the writer Abby Morgan. She said, "There's no room for doubt." And I thought that was so useful because I think anyone who, I mean, I'm sure this is true in so many walks of life, but certainly anyone who wants to kind of write, to sort of produce creative work. I mean, I personally often feel kind of crippled with
Yeah,
doubt
yeah.
of whether I can do it, whether I'm sort of good enough, or whether, all of these different
Mm.
things come along. And I think, I actually have it as a poster above my desk, and just says "no room for doubt." And I just think it's such a useful thing. It's such a waste of time to sit and doubt. And if you can find a way to just say, "No, I have no space for that. I have no time for that. That's not going to be relevant to me. I'm just going to get on."
Mm.
I think that's incredibly useful. So that's the best bit of advice that I've
Oh,
heard.
Breeze, I love it. I'm going to write it on a post-it note and stick it on my on my screen here so I don't forget. And there is a great Shakespeare quote, and I would have sounded so intellectual if I could remember it, but I can't remember it. So I'll have to update everyone later. That's basically the same thing. That doubts are traitors. Do you know the one, Breeze?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think
Yeah,
I don't know it off by heart.
yeah, I
But
need
yes,
to
I
I need to
do.
put both of those side by side on my screen so that I absolutely never forget. Such a human thing, isn't it, to just be doubting yourself, unfortunately. And very last thing, I promise, is the takeaway. So this is something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. Might be a website, might be a song to listen to, a film to watch. Do you have a takeaway for us?
Oh, I feel like my takeaway might have been that Hampton Court thing that I already said about, but I'll try and think about another one. I tell you what, if you actually just want a really good and comprehensive history
Hmm.
of what went on in the 17th century,
Yep.
then there's a book called A Monarchy Transformed by Mark Kishlansky. And I mean, it is a sort of academic adjacent book, if you like, but it's also really, really readable, and it's just so good. It's always my go-to if there's anything I kind of think, oh, I can't quite remember what happened there,
Yeah.
or like, oh, what's this? It's always there, and
Hmm.
it's something of a Bible, I think, if you work on the 17th century. So if you'd like to just
Yeah.
broadly know more, but also, I mean, to say broadly doesn't mean that
Hmm.
it sort of skims on the facts. I mean, it's really detailed. So yes, the 17th century in a nutshell. I go to A Monarchy Transformed.
A Monarchy Transformed. Love it. I will add a link to that as well. And Breeze, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I've had enormous fun.